Today's topic is focused on the built form recommendations, really focusing on what are the controls and regulatory mechanisms that the city has and can create or utilize to control the form of missing middle housing. There's going to be three parts of this first part of the presentation. I'm going to provide an overview. I'll walk through the phase 2 outreach that we are conducting right now, the framework of it. We're framing around 3 key questions. I'll introduce that, and then I'll hand it off over to Matali and Roger to discuss and talk about the preliminary recommendations around built form. So a little bit about this project, and forgive us if this is redundant information, and if you've been following us closely, you would know a lot of this information. But for those who haven't been following closely, the impetus for this project was really from the 2040 general plan that we initiated about 4 years ago now. We conducted intensive outreach, and a lot of the key concerns and issues that we heard from folks were climate change, climate adaptation, housing. Affordable housing was a big one, and so one of the key strategies that we proposed to City Council in 2021 to address those concerns that we heard from the community is a key strategy to permit a greater array of housing types, including, we're talking about duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, bungalow courts, and other courtyard communities, and small homes on small lots. ADUs we're including that in this effort as well. So that's what we're talking about, permitting a greater array of housing types throughout our neighborhoods citywide. And so that was in 2021 when council gave us direction to move forward, to explore, let's look into this as a housing strategy to produce more attainable, affordable housing units for our residents. So we commissioned this study, hired Opticos and our project team here to conduct analysis, engage with the community to understand the challenges and the benefits of missing middle housing in Sacramento, and how we can thoughtfully implement this strategy. So this graphic here shows kind of the milestones, the timeline of the project. We have completed phase 1. That was last year. If you were at our workshops last year, that phase was really about sharing information out with the community, establishing a baseline understanding of what missing middle housing is. What are we analyzing? What are we trying to achieve? So now we're in phase 2. Using all the input that we've heard, all the analysis that we conducted, this phase. Sorry about that. So this phase is the second phase that we're in right now is about sharing out some of the recommendations around solutions and design and development standard recommendations to address some of those issues and concerns and challenges that we came across as we were analyzing this strategy. And as you know, the general plan is anticipated to be adopted early next year, March, April timeframe. And so we're conducting this effort and the general plan effort simultaneously to inform one another, because this is a very complicated strategy and we want to get to respond to the community. There's a lot of uncertainty, of course, there's a lot of questions, and we're trying our best to clarify those questions and research and find solutions to the problems that we're coming across. And once the general plan is adopted, that is when, by that time, we would have the final recommendations through our engagement and through vetted through the commission and through council, and we would begin implementing and thinking about how do we incorporate this into the city code after the adoption of the general plan. And that would occur, I'm thinking right now it's looking like summer of next year, around that time frame, and it could be effective hopefully by the end of next year. So there's 4 key reports that you should keep an eye out for as part of the study. 2 has already been completed and released. The first one is an informational report. Many of you may have read it. That one was part of phase 1, sharing out information, providing baseline information on missing middle, looking at some case studies. The report 2 was just released last month about the attainability and livability of missing middle housing, how that could fit into Sacramento, looking at the context, the different built characteristics of Sacramento, figuring out which housing types could fit in where, and regulatory barriers and changes that we could consider as a way to thoughtfully implement this strategy. And reports 3 and 4 are in progress. They will come out by the end of this year. We have a displacement risk assessment report that we're working on, looking at where in the city, which neighborhoods, what factors, what considerations we should be thinking about in terms of vulnerability of being displaced with incoming investments. So that study will help inform our final recommendations. So that'll be coming. And then the final report is where we take all the information that we've heard and all the information that we've researched into a final report with the final set of recommendations that we will then take to council, get input from the community through council and the commission, and we will then take it after the adoption of the general plan to incorporate into our city code, into Title 17 Planning and Development Code. So just really quickly, and I'm sorry, this is information that you may already know. Missing middle housing, what is it? It's really house scale buildings with multiple units, usually found in walkable neighborhoods. We see this throughout Sacramento, throughout most major American cities, especially in the pre-World War II neighborhoods. And the reason why we call it missing is because for various reasons, our zoning code, for instance, building code, the way that we have been incentivizing certain types of development, we really have not been seeing this form of housing that is in between the single family product and the large apartment complexes. And so if we're talking, we're in a housing crisis, if we're talking about providing more housing and producing more housing, and if we have a system, a regulatory system where we have a dichotomy of product types that we're really targeting, that's a problem. And so it's missing in that sense. We're not seeing production of it for various reasons, and one of them is zoning. And that's one of the key characteristics of this project, is to look at what are the zoning barriers, what can we change in our zoning to allow this to happen again. It's middle in, and I described this a little bit earlier on the previous slide. It's middle in form and scale between single family product and multifamily buildings. And it's also typically attainable at a price point that a middle income household can afford. And that's usually between 60 to 110% of area median income of an area. And just really quick, something that I have observed is that, oftentimes when we talk about our housing crisis, we attribute that to a supply and demand problem, which it is. We aren't producing enough housing to meet the demand. That's why prices are high. The other factor is that we know if you compare in same area, same construction time period, year of construction, and you compare a single family product versus a middle product like a duplex, triplex, fourplex, we know that single family product is more expensive. So we have a regulatory framework that limits the production of the in-between. It's housing types that we know are more attainable than what is being built right now. Then that's the other factor of why we have a housing crisis. And so this slide just want to show you some examples that we have in the city. As I mentioned earlier, we have over 3,500 existing examples of missing middle housing throughout the city of Sacramento. And really, this project this missing middle really is about looking back into the past for innovation, something that we know has worked well in the past. This isn't the first time our country is in a housing crisis. We've been in a housing crisis. We built our way out of it in the past. And in the same way that old triplexes, fourplexes, and bungalows are still, standing today in many of our pre-war neighborhoods, the idea is that this new generation of smaller housing types or missing middle would provide attainable housing options that have not been made available to our residents for many decades due to zoning constraints. And who this could help, this could really help our aging and older adults who are retired on a fixed income, who are looking for affordable options to downsize. This will help young couples and families who doesn't need a lot of space. We have a college-age population that are currently forced to either cram into crowded living arrangements, which I'm sure many of us know someone in that situation, or they have to stay with the parents, some well into their early 30s, because housing is so expensive. And we also have intergenerational households that wish to live near one another, especially when you have Asian family members or Sikh family members, and many more lifestyles and situations that we really are not accommodating with the current way that we are producing housing. And so some typical characteristics, a missing middle is typically smaller. They should be well designed, house scale and neighborhood scale buildings. They typically have a combination of private and shared open space, which creates a sense of community. They also support walkable environments. More people living in an area means more amenities, more businesses are located there, less car dependence. And if we couple this with a transit-oriented development model where we increase or we promote missing middle near transit stations and high frequency bus stops, that could really produce and create a more sustainable way of city planning. And as I mentioned earlier, missing middle typically accommodates a wider range of lifestyles and household types than what we have now. So I kind of touched a lot of this, but why should we care about missing middle? I have a list of questions on the screen right here that I hope resonates with many of you. Housing is very expensive. Why is it so expensive? Some of us who don't own a home yet, can I ever buy a home? Prices aren't going down, they keep going up. We're not producing enough. Why are my options so limited? You have single family apartment. If you've tried looking for housing, recently, that's what you'll see. And both are very expensive options. With limited attainable options, how am I supposed to downsize in or age in place for, our more elderly folks? What if I want my Asian parent nearby, but not in the same house? We don't have something to accommodate for that. What if I don't need a lot of space? I just need a place that I can afford to live. And for those of us who want to, have the means, have the capital, have the equity to invest in our neighborhood, where can I start? Missing middle can provide that opportunity and that pathway for those who want to invest in neighborhoods. I'll skip this slide. I think we all know the state of our housing crisis. A huge portion of our city residents and around the country are housing burdened, meaning that we pay over 30% of our monthly income on housing, on rent and mortgage. We also have increasing baby boomers and increasing millennial population that needs different types of living situations and housing products to accommodate their lifestyles. And so the other part of missing middle is we are in a housing crisis. We know we need to build more housing. We know we need to build different types of housing that's more attainable. The neat thing about missing middle is that it can blend into existing neighborhoods much better than large multifamily complexes can. And sure, we can build a lot of housing through multifamily products, but then we're missing out on being able to use the land a little bit more efficiently and promoting more transit-oriented communities, more walkable communities, supporting our local businesses. We're missing out on those opportunities if we don't allow for this missing middle scale of housing. And so that's what it could look like. We're talking about infill, we're talking about accessory dwelling units, we're talking about converting your garage, we're talking about partitioning up a large, 4-bedroom home into 2 smaller units. Just think about the possibilities and the economic opportunities and the housing opportunities that could provide for our residents. So phase 2 outreach, I'm going to go over how phase 1 outreach has informed our current approach in this current phase. So we held a series of workshops, virtual and in person, and we had an online workshop last year. We heard general support. A lot of folks have actually experienced living in missing middle, and they actually had a good experience with missing middle housing. And some of the key design elements that were brought up were size, scale, placement on the lot, facade design, open space, and of course tree conservation. Concerns included parking, open space, trees. So those are all things that we have we took that to heart, and now we're coming back with recommendations on how we can address those problems and those concerns. So the input that we heard can really be categorized and captured by these 3 key questions, which I think has really helped us to kind of hone in on the main key issues here. So number one is what we're focusing on today. Number one is, what could missing middle housing look like in Sacramento? We'll talk about that today. And number two is, will missing middle housing be lower cost and attainable? How can we promote and encourage more attainable housing types? We'll talk about that on October 19th. Same with question number three. We'll talk about number three on October 19th as well. Number three is about how can the city promote home ownership and address potential displacement through missing middle housing. And just really quickly, I want to talk about what we are thinking in terms of, the criteria that we're using to evaluate how successful we are with our missing middle program and recommendations. Is we have three objectives here. Really, we have one is feasibility. The second one is attainability for residents and consumers, and then we have livability. And what that really means is, in order for our missing middle program to be successful, we believe that we have to ensure, one, that these homes are actually feasible and can be constructed and not just a paper exercise, that they're actually attainable and lower cost, and help reduce housing costs in a region. So, our regulations cannot be so burdensome that, that would pass down the cost to consumers, and make housing, unaffordable. And of course, they should fit well into our existing neighborhoods and even enhance our many different diverse neighborhoods and communities in Sacramento. So those are the three criteria that we're using to assess success. So yesterday, I don't know if some of you may have been able to make it out, but we had an in-person event at the Culture Club. We called this in-person event Connecting the Dots on housing. We had a pretty good turnout. This event really was about introducing the recommendations and the online workshop. It was really a launch event of our workshop. And, we actually saw 150, at least 150 folks who came out. We had 200 RSVPs and a lot of folks came out. And we heard a lot of good input, a lot of good feedback, and there was a lot of excitement around the missing middle strategy, which is, I think indicative of how bad our housing crisis is. So what's next? So before I let Opticos take over, I'm going to talk about next steps. So today, you're here today to listen and to learn about the built form recommendations. On the 19th, we'll do a similar webinar with a focus on recommendations for attainability and ownership, which is question number 2, number 3 that I showed you earlier. We have a planning commission meeting that's scheduled on the 12th, where we'll present these recommendations to them. We'll have a city council meeting on the 24th. I'm also presenting and sharing recommendations and the input that we received thus far to the council. Keep an eye out for reports 3 and 4 that I mentioned earlier. That will be released by the end of this year. And as I mentioned, after the adoption of the general plan early next year, we will work on amending the zoning code to permit missing middle housing. And the final piece is we have an online workshop, which I'm sure many of you have seen. It was launched yesterday. So please visit that workshop, and we'll show you at the second part of this webinar on how to provide input. But the input that you provide on that online workshop will help shape the final zoning and policy recommendations that'll come out of the study. So yeah, I'll stop there. I know I've been talking a lot. I'm going to pass it on over to Mitali.
So this is where, I want to kind of do a slightly deeper dive into our preliminary recommendations. And again, I do want to start with the fact that these are not all fully baked or final, but this is the result of some pretty exhaustive analysis and citywide, actual deep feasibility tests and other studies that we've carried out over the last 6-8 months. So as Nguyen provided the overview of, we are trying to make missing middle work, for Sacramento. And it's not like a one solution for each and every place. We want these recommendations for missing middle to be place-based, and that is the underlying fundamental principle that is guiding all our analysis. So as Nguyen highlighted, we have 3 main questions, and the focus of today's recommendation discussion will be on the built form. Like, what could this look like in Sacramento? So to start us off, I want to talk about our citywide analysis. So now, since we'll be applying missing middle housing across all of Sacramento, we do want to first of all understand just exactly what kind of underlying characteristics are already there that we can learn from and contribute to. So now all that kind of sounds very fancy, but I would almost think of it as understanding what the DNA is of Sacramento neighborhoods and responding to that, so that what we introduce in the form of missing middle housing is a positive addition. It fits well, it is compatible, and in other words, it enhances, the underlying character of the neighborhoods that we have. The focus of the missing middle housing study are 4 of the city's zoning districts. These are R1, R1A, R1B, and R2. And the map that you see on the page highlights, all these different zones by color. And as you can see, it sounds like a small number. It's 4 zones, but it covers pretty much most of the city's land that is zoned for residential use. So we are looking at these 4 zones, pretty much all of the residential zone land in the city. And our analysis looked at understanding all the different characteristics that we know are very important for missing middle to be successful. So as you can see down below, we looked at the underlying zoning and the pattern of land uses. But equally importantly, we looked at how well connected these places are. Are these areas walkable? Do they have access to amenities and to transit? We also looked at the existing built form characteristics, like do you have larger buildings? Do you have attached or detached buildings? Do you have like single family residential of just very small footprint buildings? Or do you have existing patterns of missing middle the way we have closer to the central core of the city? We also looked at lot sizes, because that's a very important part of determining what kind of missing middle types can go where. Like we cannot recommend a type that cannot physically fit on an existing lot. So based on analyzing all of these, important characteristics, we came up with what we're calling context types. So these context types basically are like, it's like a synthesis of the underlying built form, built characteristics, level of connectivity, degree of access, all these factors kind of boiled into like a character zone in a way. And we established all of these existing Sacramento areas into 6 context types. Now, the interesting thing is, and you can see the names on the screen, but the interesting thing is that not all of them are perfectly suited for missing middle. So looking at the focus of our study, looking at the geographies where we'll be working citywide, 3 of these context types are the ones that have been selected as absolutely ready for missing middle housing to be implemented. And these fall into the categories of compact and connected, transitional, and low-scale residential. So even from the names, you can ascertain that these are areas which are slightly differing in terms of the levels of connectivity, how much of access they have to not just transit, but also to other everyday users, which makes them more walkable, and also where they lie in different parts of the city. So another parallel bit of research that we have been conducting is to understand what are the different types of households that exist in Sacramento, what are the different demographic patterns that are existing already, and to also study how we can best serve them. So the objective, again, is not of dumping as much housing as we can wherever it can fit. The idea is to calibrate what should be appropriate in each of these context types, with also what kind of households would likely live there. So say, for example, if you have a family with very young kids, and for you, a backyard space is very important, then you may not choose to live bang in the middle of downtown. But for other people, say, for example, a family who's downsizing, or for people who want like everyday amenities within like a walking distance, then for such people, living closer to downtown and in other compact and connected areas is much more attractive. So for us to recommend these missing middle housing recommendations, which is the focus for today, we need to understand not just what can physically fit, but also what is compatible and appropriate for different parts of Sacramento. So our recommendations fall under several categories. 6 of these are pretty major. And then there are some additional ones which are slightly more minor, but equally important, which we will be discussing today. And to start us off, I'm going to talk about the missing middle housing districts. So this is our first recommendation. This is also a pretty important and major wide-ranging recommendation. So we just want to do a slightly deeper dive. You see this color-coded map, and in a way, this correlates very closely with the context types map that I was showing just a little while ago. So this shows how we plan to implement or apply missing middle housing throughout the city. And we are proposing to do this through 3 tiers of missing middle. So there would be 3 missing middle housing districts or MMH districts citywide, and each are calibrated to these existing conditions that we have just discussed and that we spent over like a year analyzing. The 3 colors that you see here, the blue color corresponds to tier 1, and you'll see the, like in notations next to it is 2 plus 2. And I'll just explain that in a minute. We also have tier 2, which corresponds loosely to the compact and connected area that we saw and parts of transitional. And there's also tier 3, which is in a way more intense, but it's located in a pretty small area right here within kind of the reach of the downtown core. Also, you'll see mapped on this are the existing transit networks, the existing light rail, the planned light rail, and also high frequency bus routes. This is again reinforcing the fact that missing middle housing can be most successful in environments that have better access to transit and other amenities and areas that are inherently more walkable. So now, based on that, we also have this table, which compares what we are proposing for each of these missing middle housing districts and comparing that to what is currently allowed. So just a reminder that we are working in 4 of these zoning districts, the R1, which covers like almost 70% of the residential zone land, R1A and R1B. So this table highlights how tier 1 would cover parts of R1A and R1. And since R1 is so large, it spans several of these missing middle housing tiers. Tier 2 would apply to R1, R2, and R1B, again, depending on the geography. And tier 3 corresponds almost exactly with the existing R1B zoning district. These numbers mean the total number of units that we are allowing. So when we say 2 plus 2, we're talking about 2 primary units, in other words, something like a duplex, and 2 ADUs. And you can see over here, it's also highlighted the percentages of the residential zoned land that will likely have options to develop these kind of missing middle housing types. So in summary, it's not as if there is going to be a drastic change. It's not as if we are recommending 8-story buildings in the middle of single-family residential neighborhoods. The intent is to introduce missing middle housing in a way that complements the existing residential character, but provides more housing. And also, as Roger after me will explain, how we are controlling for the fact that these new missing middle housing types will be a good fit, not just in terms of physical form, but also in terms of providing more attainable, smaller, more naturally affordable units for middle income earners and like other households in Sacramento. So if you want to think about a visual of what these types can look like, say in the tier 1 district that we just talked about, which covers 48% of the city's land, when we're talking about 2 primary units and an ADU and 2 ADUs, a typical example of missing middle is that of a duplex. So from the street, this is what you see. And all the examples that you see on this slide are from Sacramento. So it's not as if we are trying to introduce something new. Sacramento is like literally like a laboratory of excellent examples of missing middle, of a wide range of these types as well. What you see in the middle of the screen is a tier 2 district example of what missing middle can look like. This includes 4 primary units, so say a typical 4-plex, and 2 ADUs, and this would be covering 31% of the city's residential zoned land. And the third photo example that you see here is of a 6-plex. So this is pretty much the most intense missing middle type that we are recommending, and this is coming within the R1B district, which is just outside the central core of the city. So in other words, what we are trying to propose is to increase housing, to make housing more naturally attainable to middle-income earners. But what you see on the screen now is literally what missing middle housing could look like. You could walk past it and not even realize that this is a 4-plex or a duplex unless you look very closely. And then you start noticing that, oh yes, there are 2 entry doors. So this is likely it's not a single family home. But in terms of the look and feel and the way it sits on a particular lot, missing middle types have this unique property of being very good neighbors to classic single family homes. So which is why we think that this is like a positive addition to the neighborhood. It makes neighborhoods more kind of diverse and more accepting of all the good things that Nguyen already talked about, whether it's entry-level home ownership or if it's aging in place, of just having a more lively neighborhood, supporting the local economy. All these things are made possible, but without compromising the existing built character of our neighborhoods. So this illustration that you see can also be broken up into a whole range of these different things that we actually regulate. So it's not like we wave a magic wand and we say, just build a missing middle housing type, and this is the only type that you build, because that would really restrict, creative expression and architecture in the city. Instead, what the missing middle housing study will do in the form of these build form recommendations is to regulate all these different things that are very critical. And as I said, Roger is about to take you through all of these in a lot of detail. But as you can see, it's like a sum of these parts. All these different things come together to create a missing middle type that is, again, a good neighbor to a classic single family home. And as you can see, our recommendations are they're fairly agnostic or neutral towards architectural style. So the previous example that you saw and this kind of Spanish revival type of example that you're seeing, both of them can be built using the build form recommendations that we are looking at. So that we're looking at recommending to you and getting feedback on. So with that overview, Roger, I think you should kind of take over the real stuff, which is what are each of these recommendations and what are we proposing?
Thank you, Mitali. That's a great overview. And yes, now we're going to be going into a little more detail on the specific recommendations that you saw summarized in the image. So part of that was relating to open space. The current standards do not require a specific amount of open space for single unit or duplex dwellings. But as soon as you get to 3 units and higher, they require 100 square feet of open space per unit, but this cannot be counting the setback areas, which already take up a good bit of the land, especially on these smaller infill lots. Another factor is that deviations from the standards to protect existing trees require a public hearing, which adds to the project cost and time. So when we think about missing middle, we want to enable this to happen on many lots throughout the city. And so we want to streamline the process as much as we can and take care of the major concerns in the standards themselves. So in in terms of how this is a barrier for missing middle housing, it's not that the amount of the required open space is a barrier, but when we're talking about a building with multiple units, we want to make sure that the open space that is provided is usable by the residents, especially if it's going to serve as a common open space for multiple units. So the recommendations that we're looking at will actually increase the amount of required open space for the missing middle types from 100 to 125 square feet per unit. But in exchange for this, we will allow that open space to take advantage of the setback area, provided that the open space is well-sited and functional. And we're essentially defining this to mean that it meets these certain dimensions, which will make it usable by the residents, and that it has a tree canopy for shade. And this can be achieved either by preserving an existing tree on the site or by planting a new tree if there isn't one already present. And in addition, we're recommending flexibility to the development standards for the purpose of protecting existing trees so that you wouldn't have to go through this hearing process that you currently do. There would be options built in to allow you to adjust the site plan to preserve those trees. And in terms of the front setbacks, as it stands right now, Sacramento does require the front of the new building to align with the fronts of the neighboring buildings. But as you can see from the aerial photo, this can actually take up a large chunk of the site. If you have a 20-foot setback like it's shown here and the lot is not terribly deep. And there's also not really any guidance for the design of the front setbacks to ensure that the fronts of the buildings will engage with the street and provide that connection between the residents and the neighbors. And again, to protect trees, you would need a public hearing. For example, if you had a tree in the back and nothing in the front, you wouldn't be permitted to shift your building forward to protect the tree unless you went through this process, which of course adds cost and time. So recommendations regarding the front setbacks are to reduce the default 20-foot setback to perhaps 15 or even 10. So this is in areas where the front setback would not necessarily be decided by the neighboring buildings, but you would have to go by the baseline. In infill scenarios, you'd still be matching more or less with the neighboring buildings, but you would have an option for projecting a portion of the building into the front setback, provided that you're including certain amenities for the frontage, like a 6-foot deep porch or a new shade tree, things that would help to enliven the streetscape, as you can see in the lower image. And we would also allow a larger projection for corner lots, but with greater incentives for planting trees in the side setbacks, since there's more available land there. And similarly to what we examined before, there would be flexibility to the development standards for protecting existing trees. So this would result in buildings that would engage more closely with the sidewalk and sort of provide an opportunity for more interaction between neighbors along the street. So this is an example of what that might look like once it gets all built out with a particular architectural expression. So you can see the 6-foot deep porch there, which is providing a space for people to have sort of an intermediate space between the house and the street. And then the projection into the setback, which is the portion of the facade that's right there, yeah, where the cursor is. So the current standards in R1 require at least 5,200 square feet for any new lot. So this would be a 15-foot wide, 100 feet deep, for example. And the reason why we're considering this a barrier is because for what would be a starter home in today's market, it makes it very difficult to create something like that because so much of the cost of the project is built into the cost of the land. And so, yeah, this makes it hard to create starter homes for middle income earners. So as an alternative, the proposed standards would allow smaller lots for smaller homes. So if the building that you're building is 1,000 square feet or less in area, it could be built on a lot as small as 1,300 square feet. And what this would make possible is creating new ownership opportunities in a setup like a cottage court, for example, which is what the image is showing, how on an existing lot that's especially deep, you could actually introduce new lots there for the cottages, which would provide an opportunity for someone to purchase a home at a lower price point than might otherwise be available in Sacramento. So for the building envelope, there are a couple of standards that are controlling this. For example, currently, single unit and duplexes are required to fit within what's called a bulk control tent, which is intended to avoid out of scale massing within neighborhoods that are dominated by single family homes. And it effectively requires a greater setback for upper stories. So if you have a 2-story building, it would have to be further from the lot line than if it were 1 story. There are allowances for projections beyond that bulk control tent, such as dormer windows. but there are limits on how much of that building can project. And floor area ratio basically refers to the amount of building relative to the amount of land that it's sitting on. They currently apply only to mixed use and non-residential projects, but in the proposed general plan, this could be extended to residential. So this is a significant issue for missing middle types because so many of the missing middle types are essentially 2-story buildings, or maybe 2.5 stories with the occupiable roof space with the dormer windows. But essentially, it's within a similar footprint as a single-family home would be, but you need that second story to get the additional units that fill out the type. And so this becomes difficult to do if your bulk control tent is constricting the upper story more so than the ground floor. And so this is showing an example of the effect that has on a side-by-side duplex, for example, how a portion of the building is poking through that tent. That's the white portion that you see. So these recommendations will include slight modifications to the bulk control tent for missing middle housing with 3 or more units. But there would be stipulations in the standards to make sure that the buildings are still well articulated. And the existing bulk control tent would remain for single unit and duplexes as they're applied now, because the need for modifications there is not as significant. There would also be modifications to the bulk control tent to make sure that attached types like townhouses would be allowed, as well as a side-by-side duplex in which you have both units meeting at a vertical wall down the middle. And in the proposed general plan, there also will be maximum FIRs, which will apply to residential projects, meaning that the amount of building relative to the amount of lot will be limited for residential as well as for the commercial and mixed use. And that will vary according to the geography. There are no changes proposed to the current height limits, which stand at 35 feet in most of these zones, or to the maximum allowed lot coverage and the side and rear setbacks. Those will remain as they are. So in the current standards, Sacramento requires any development with more than 2 primary units to include a 24-foot wide commercial driveway. And since a lot of the lots that we're considering for missing middle are infill lots, which might be 52 feet wide, you can see how this easily eats up a large chunk of that lot. Most of the infill lots are not wide enough to fit that kind of driveway. The assumptions that are built into this requirement are that you're going to have a lot of cars coming in and out because it's a quote unquote multi-unit project. But for most missing middle applications, that's simply not the reality. So the recommendations are including a proposal to redefine the residential and commercial driveways based on the number of on-site parking spaces rather than the number of housing units. So this would enable something like a fourplex to use the same sort of driveway as you would use for a duplex under the current standards. So we're considering how the required width could be reduced to better match the types that are under consideration. Now on to some of the more minor recommendations. Waste collection will generally need to be handled a little bit differently for the missing middle types. It doesn't always make sense for each unit to have its own full-sized garbage bin, for example. And you can imagine how that could get out of hand the more units you have if you require an excess of bins. Current regulations allow one one can to be shared for the organic waste. But in the recommendations, we're considering sharing of the other streams as well. So this is to allow sharing of larger garbage and recycling front load bins for up to 4 units on the same lot, provided that you can meet the requirements for capacity and that they're serviced adequately. There are standards for maintaining privacy in the existing infill housing design standards. Our recommendation is to review and update these because they are currently not really specific enough to do their job. So the recommendation is to specify strategies for meeting the goals of the standards. For example, frosted glass, higher sills, describing exactly what they mean by screening, or how you would offset your windows from the adjacent building's windows, etc. And then regarding concerns about adequate community review and input, there is a proposal to maintain a discretionary design review process as this is rolled out, which will allow opportunity for community input while the standards are being applied initially. And that pretty much brings us to our conclusion. So this QR code will take you to the link where you can provide feedback on the proposal as it stands. And that's definitely valuable for us to take into account as we reach the final stages here.